Springburn developed from a rural hamlet at the beginning of the 19th century and was eventually incorporated into the city boundary in the early 20th century. The area's economic development had strong historical links to heavy industry, particularly railways, with the manufacturing of locomotives. The old urban centre of Springburn was rapidly redeveloped from the early 1970s to the early 1980s, as it was selected as one of Glasgow's comprehensive development areas. These years saw the demolition of 85% of historic buildings within the district and the construction of a sequence of housing estates, which transformed the area completely. I invited different community leaders, activists and cultural workers to the Springburn Winter Gardens to take part in a group discussion on the different ways in which we are working to conserve and celebrate the built environment within Springburn.
Well, just to say, I think it's really it's traumatic for a community and for people to see buildings that obviously played a very big part, and not only playing. These buildings don't only play a very big part. I mean, there were probably, I would say, people who built these who were involved in the engineering, the maintenance, but really buildings are about the use and what people make the building. It's not just mortar and stones. It's really the function and how people and something that has community, but also the history where people, they go past that building, they have a certain pride because they might remember that party or that session, or they did the facade, or they did this and that. And I'm just really struck, not being from Glasgow or even the UK. I've lived in various places, but I think I've also never come across really a place where people are so passionate and engaged about and with their heritage or the public art that's here. Sometimes I find it really frustrating because I think the one thing Glasgow and its communities really has in abundance, which other places don't have, is this willingness of the people who live here to become engaged and involved. And very often I do find that the modern, if it's health and safety, if it's owner and protection laws, are actually to some extent really counterproductive and can often be used to then just put everything on hold. And there is a lack of decision making, but also with places like this where the stakeholders it's a really complex matter because it is the public. It's where it's really a lack of, I think, conversation and decision making with the people involved that then ends up that nothing is done. And I don't know how it is for someone who, I mean, I find these buildings incredible. They should be really preserved. Even they have an international significance. It's industrial heritage. I think it's really important.
You know, Springburn used to be this massive powerhouse of industry, and then and you get into sort of the 1950s when deindustrialization starts to happen. There's the collapse in the locomotive industry, which this area was known for, and then the population halves because of, you know, these new builds outside of the city, at the corners of the city, so people are pushed out of the centre of the city, and you have less resources, and then this is kind of what happens. So obviously the Winter Gardens in the 1980s was some of the glass was damaged in a storm, and Glasgow City Council took the decision to close it. But once you close it, this is the end outcome of that. And even what you were talking about, like who makes these decisions, it's usually never the community that makes the final decision. So if we take the public halls that the community didn't want demolished, we're actively trying to save it over the course of several years, and understood how much that meant to their identity and self-preservation. And, you know, if you actually look at Springburn, 85% was the built environment was demolished to make way for motorways and other infrastructure changes at housing estates. And with the public halls in particular, the decision to demolish them was one thing, but the decision over the maiden statues outside, when I think it was you that was telling me about one of your colleagues said they don't collect architectural salvage.
It was literally, Elaine and me, I think it took us a couple of months to realize that coming from very different angles, but we were both kind of concerned, and I think it took us a year to just even find out where are these sculptures, are they even there? Because again, different people we approached, oh, this is not us, this is this department, these are these guys, we weren't involved, we just did this. So again, it's this kind of having no access, who's actually responsible.
It's similar as well with another statue in Springburn when there was the Heritage and Hope statue, because that was something that always was brought up because it was damaged, I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, and it was always outside the old library, and everyone was like, would maybe ask us sometimes at a community council, I would remember, going, what happens to that statue that was there? And no one would have an idea until, I think it was a rumour, or someone came up to me and I heard that there's maybe a statue in Edinburgh somewhere, and there's a foundry you need to find. And I phoned them up and went, can I see if they've got the statue? And I went and visited, and they had the statue in storage because they just fixed the fingers from it, and that was it. And it's still in storage, but no one had that communication of that way of these stuff.
That was the exact same. So we, me and Elaine and Steph, went and visited the maiden statues that were outside the public halls. Nobody really knew what had happened to them after sort of 2012, 2014 maybe. It was the last time somebody had, and they're outside in a salvage yard in the elements, so they've started to grow new things on their faces and stuff. And I think there's a massive problem, especially within this community, where there is a dismantling of working class heritage and culture which you don't see in other places. And even when community members are very vocal around it, they are still ignored. And that whole kind of like with the decision made that those statues are architectural heritage, but the community sees them as sculptures. You had even said that they were sculptures in a publication or something, and
yes, they are part of. There was a big kind of mapping of public sculpture all over the UK, and there is a big publication just on all the public sculpture in Glasgow. And they are listed in there. They were actually, it comes, and it's very interesting. It's a really good publication. It's also for London, for Liverpool, but Glasgow is a big one. And it even has that the building was listed. It has the owner of the building. It's a very interesting publication.
Well, that's what I mean.
And
so
they're in there specifically.
The law only sort of suits when it's in the hands of already powerful people. So it's like, I can say that these are architectural salvage, but there could be 200 community members saying they're not architectural salvage. We see them as sculptures. We see them as like, the Mona Lisa of Springburn, if you will. And still, they would still be like, they're not worth collecting or, preserving or stuff like that. And I think that's a real shame. So I think now we're in this stage of community members will just do it, and they have to reclaim that power and be like, no, you're not gonna do this anymore.
Like when the hub, and there would be plans for that were put down of the Winter Gardens and what people were potentially wanting to do with that. People would always keep asking what's happening with that building, what's happening with Winter Gardens. They still always come in and they still ask that. Same with the Talisman, they always ask what's happening in that space, because they're objects that they remember in recent memory of them being able to be used. Like this was the 80s. Similar, the Talisman was like the 80s or something like that as well.
It's a foundation that memories and stories are built on. Like you're saying about architectural salvage, that might be what it was termed as, but it's actually a container for stories from the local community, and everybody probably has a different story about those sculptures and about the building that it was on as well.
Talisman, I don't know when it was built.
I don't know. It was
of its time.
It's been dealt more than I've been alive, so I don't really remember much about it.
70s, I think, but it was a venue for weddings. It was a venue for community events and things, fun events, family events, but it kind of went into ruin. It was closed and it's been left to, what's the word?
Disintegrate.
That's the word, disintegrate. And it literally has been for about 25, plus years. So it's a danger. It was a sign, it kind of seems to be the sign of the times in Springburn, doesn't it? That's the number one question. If we get rid of the Talisman, it's a sign of change for the better for the future. It's on a hill, it's above eye level, people can see it from all directions. I can see it, I'm 14 flights up.
It's something that's defined Springburn a lot of the time. Like whenever you Google Springburn or whatever and you go to images, that will be one of the key images that will keep coming up and up and up, is that sort of this building. And despite the community pressure about it, it's always
Yeah.
been again landed issues on who's been owning it
That's what
and
it
what.
was.
that
It's
comes
almost
from.
like a metaphor in some ways of how the outside world views Springburn, which is obviously something you're desperate to get rid of because we all know it's not the case.
The community, it's that kind of about power and who has power. And when the community were actively trying to save public halls, which a lot of people felt was so strongly and so attached to, it was demolished. But when the community is actively trying to get a building demolished because of safety concerns, it's kept.
Yeah.
And that's all to do with like land ownership and who owns what and
Money.
who.
It's because it was previously owned by the same people who would own nearby bits of land in that way with the shops and such like that. But now it's just literally as a landed asset, and it's not treated as anything that is a community asset in any way, as a piece of land that can be used for community use.
There's nothing you can actually physically do in use site, and it kind of exhausts community members to the point where they just give up. That's where I am with the Carnegie Library. So the old Carnegie Library was built in 1904. It was used as a library until the new library was built, and it was the only place where community members, it was a museum as well, where community members owned and managed it for historical reference in the community. And then it got moved to the new library, which was a tiny little room, and then that faded away. With that, it's now in Glasgow City Council's hands. They have signed a lease with another body, and it's basically empty. So that's the route I was going to take in terms of the compulsory purchase order, so that we own it and we manage it and we decide what happens with it in the end. But what will most likely happen is when their lease ends, they will leave the building and it will just become something like this.
No, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Just a couple of years ago, we did a community consultation. Thomas was part of that. Great help as well. We asked folk what they wanted for the future. Simple questions, and it took us a few months. It took us about 3 years to get it planned and done, but it took just a few months, and the folk were coming out of the woodwork and they wanted change. So that was part of it. We're looking and hoping that the Carnegie Library will be a focus for arts and heritage. It's a small building, it's a wee gem. When it was built, it faced the right way with that the road. It's taken the focus off the front and all the architecture. At the back, it's not very attractive. But we're even thinking about trying to add an application for funding. This is one of the projects to try and create an atrium glass that brings the back up to the front as a focus for arts and heritage. But as artist space, the possibilities are endless. But it's a time that we can actually bring back a focus of the heritage. For me, it's the heritage. I understand the amazing work that working in the art side can bring stories alive again, because I took part in it. But no, this time I'm determined it's not going to happen.
That's what I mean. So we effectively have about 4 years before that happens. There is new damage in the building because of the bad weather. So it's, and when I was doing the Glasgow International project, the whole idea of that project is to activate the space so that not because we know the potential, but wider Glasgow residents and the council and all these public bodies that are in charge of funding and hold a lot of the power don't know its potential. So I think if we get that started and then we just continue doing that.
The most straightforward thing, but I don't know how that could work, is for the community to reclaim the building. And by that I don't know how the council is about that, if you can actually approach the council and say we buy the building and the land. Because in a way what it kind of, this kind of apathy, I just call it apathy, it's just not doing anything. And I think again this is there's so much creativity happening. So in a way you're using a space at no cost to the council, but they are still benefiting from it. And I think there is a lot been going on with arts and sustainability, a lot of where I think artists have been really exploited. And, you know, where it looks all very good. But it is true, where it looks
I'm going to get
very
that as a
good.
caption.
Where it looks very good.
Yeah, but I mean...
But I still think because in a way, I don't think you need all of these specialist trained people. That adds all of these layers of complexity and cost, and you need a survey. I mean, even hearing, you know, how some buildings like this are just left to fall apart, and thinking, I'm sure there would have been so many people in Springburn community who could have fixed that glass.
Absolutely.
Who could have come in and rewire the electrics.
Yeah.
And, you know, and this is where you get into the community basically reclaiming
we have done that before, because even in the community hub it was asking favours for people to come in, do the rewiring.
Because I mean, community buyouts and such like that has been quite successful for in north east of Glasgow already with BCDC. They were the first one to do it in Scotland, for the community land fund, I think it was. But again, it's an issue when it comes to things like with libraries. Even like last week when you've seen about the libraries on the south side that have been threatened with closure from Glasgow Life, because there's that insustainability and how community assets have been kind of worked in that way, and it makes you think on how best community assets like that are actually used.
The problem is that the legislation, so for example, with the sculptures or with, it's then easy for someone to say, oh, you can't just have people do this who want to do it. You need to have health and safety assessment and risk assessment. So it's all of these mechanisms again that basically holds just power. So there's no ownership. There's no ownership. And
I remember a few years ago, it was before I moved here, the Theatre Royal were here and they did some plays. And I remember seeing an image of lights, just the building as it is, clear, obviously, or clean. And it was a living work of art. And if we could just have that, for me, the different colours and the shape of the building was clean, clear, safe. But it looked like something like the Roman Colosseum.
You necessarily don't need a fully fitted out building. You just need it to be up in health and safety standard. But then you could do sound art, light art, outdoor screenings, that sort of stuff. So it activates the space and gets people interested in it, and then build from that into making a case for a proper venue for Springburn.
Yeah.
A bit like what Platform does in Easterhouse. You get people going up for gigs and things like that. Actually making Springburn a place that people want to go to. And also tourists as well. I think the really frustrating thing that I have is that when tourists come to Glasgow, they're always in the city centre. And I know that all the communities around Glasgow are all doing such fantastic work from artistic, theatre, all that kind of point of view, but nobody ever ventures out from the city centre. And it's having something that will draw people out.
There was an article about the auditorium space within the old community village space, because it got like national press from it, because it was such a astounding thing that people were like, this is a brilliant space, and yet it's in a place where no one was bothering about it. It was derelict for years by the council because it was an old depot, and it just because it became a community leased space, it brought new life to a space which they didn't even think about to be using.
I think really for me, the community village is about making the park the centre of the community, because we've got like the shopping centre, which is the centre of the community, which is a commercial space about like making money, whereas I think with the park, that's bringing not just Springburn but the other communities together. And if we make the centre of our community in the centre of the park, then people are using the space. People were
the Bishop Briggs folk who go to the park run, they all go to the cafe there now instead of going to the cafe up in Bishop Briggs. The Gambian community, when they had the event, they're based in Ibrox, but they came up here for their 3-day week event and such like that. And it's all this sort of using it as a centre again, for across not just our communities but across communities around Glasgow.
I always say, Elaine might know that I'm very biased with conservation, and I always say everyone's a conservator, really. This is all recycling and reusing in many ways. And I mean, with a park of, when these things were laid out in Victorian times or after, I mean, this was also the park that was the purpose of a park or a public hall. They were meant to be the space, the centre for the community. And so in a way, I sometimes it's the thing when that really is the meaning. It's the meaning of a place or a space. It has again, it goes back to, it's not just bricks and mortar. It has a function, and I think it will be very interesting what's happening to all of these shopping centers and streets after, especially with this pandemic now, because there was already with after the credit crunch, they became more and more shop facades being empty. So
but it's almost like that decision was taken. The centre,
city
but exactly the centre of your community is that shopping centre, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
These sort of things, those sort of things, like the way that Springburn developed naturally, and it was a real sort of place of industry and stuff. That's been taken away because then it was man-made of how people moved in their community, where they lived, how they saw their friends and family members, and what amenities they used, because it wasn't organic and by community members. And I think that's what kind of needs to come back, where the powers are within our hands to change our built environment.
There was a lot of slum areas, but there was a lot that wasn't. The tenements Glasgow's famous for the tenements, absolutely. And to be honest, I would love to live in a tenement. I mean, 14 flights up. The shopping centre itself, it's the centre of Springburn, but folk don't walk the length of themselves. It's a depressing area, but it is all about spending money. But we've got a space in the community council, or the community have a space in it, Springburn Community Hub, and we're actually helping to try and bring folk back in. So rather than taking the decision away from us, they're asking us for help now. And there's another building we're trying to get into in front of the shopping centre. That used to be the Clydesdale Bank, and it's going to be community run as well. When we carried out the charrette, the consultation, number one in the list was this park. Number one in the list was everything about this park, the history of this park, Moses Field House, the fact that the first car in Scotland was designed and built up here, the Winter Gardens itself, but the history, the locomotive history. It was a gift. Was it from Hugh Reid or was it James Reid? I can't remember. Dad and son. But this was the start, and it's kind of should go back to how it was as well. This is the number one area that folk want fixed, if you like.
The Reid family were instrumental in building up Springburn, not just because of job creation, but that family took a real care for its workers, having leisure facilities. So they built this, they gave land. A lot of the allotments are land that's given by their family that the Glasgow City Council can't touch. And I think it's a real shame that you don't have that care anymore. Care in terms of like a person or people in power to give away their own power and their own wealth so that they can create like real developments within communities and taking ownership of their spaces and their land and stuff.
It's a total disengagement. It's basically, and it's to think that people, and I think it's on so many levels, not just locally or in a community. I mean, I think we all find it probably for the UK and politics and everything is that you don't know who's making decisions. You don't know what conversations are had. You never have the chance to be part of any of these conversations. And all of a sudden, you're told something has been decided that has a direct impact on everything where you live, what you do, what you can do.
We have 2 Rennie Mackintosh buildings here that nobody knew about, including Rennie Mackintosh Preservation Society.
So that building was the first ever building that Charles Rennie Mackintosh built as a sort of apprentice, and it was for his. There's a bit of back and forth. We don't know if it's his uncle or his cousin, but he built 2 houses. He did these crazy designs, and then his cousin or uncle had said, "Can we actually dial this back a bit?" But out of the whole redevelopment of Springburn in the 70s, those were the 2 buildings that were saved. And even within that, the whole loss of those conversations of how those buildings were saved, but the actual history of those buildings hasn't been told yet either. So we've lost that sort of historical reference. And we kind of need to start, we might not be able to get that back, but we can, we can start new narratives. So if that's like, we're the owners of those 2 buildings, we can celebrate the fact that that was his first ever build in Scotland, and it was here in this very community, and we need to celebrate that. When I did different workshops with kids in the area, they had no idea, and they should know about that, but they should also know about, like, well, how do we continue this, and how do we start changing the whole dynamic?
I think nowadays folk are actually beginning to respect the community, because the community power does exist, and it's strong. It really is strong. And I think community activism, actually doing something, empowerment, is giving folk the strength, and not giving, but learning more about learning your own resilience and taking action.
What you were talking about stories and about intergenerational learning and all that kind of stuff, and also thinking about new communities as well, and how they found out about the new area where they're trying to put down their own roots. The way that they can find out about how that area has progressed and how it's come about to be what it is through the intangible stuff and also the tangible stuff too. Obviously Springburn, a lot of it was built on apprenticeship, because that was how people got jobs. That's where it all started, and it's almost like flipping it on its head, and it's not a kind of apprenticeship that's structured to industry, but it's like a community apprenticeship almost, because it's that kind of community skill that's being shared and being taught through you know, doing things like refurbishing this space or working on the hub or all these kind of things.
But I think that's how you get true sustainability.
Of course.
For me, it's really taking this apart, and again with conservation, for me it is conservation and sustainability are really interlinked, and it's breaking it apart. It is sustainability, and it's the ability to help yourself. And humans, this is when I work with archaeological ancient civilizations, and I'm always just struck at that human ingenuity of problem solving, and every human has that ability. So there is really, and for me, these will be definitely the models of the future, because to just always get an expert and chuck lots of money at something, this is why this is as it is. But if there is really, it's really getting into empowering people, and if someone helps with building something up or cleaning something up, they will not be vandalizing it on a Saturday night. They won't. So once you get into, you need a museum, I think that's already quite a sad thing.
Yeah.
If your heritage or your life, you find that in a museum display, and it's no longer a living thing of,
It's
you know.
getting that two-way thing. So, like, all this discussion has been about your heritage and what has been in the past in Springburn, and how it then helps to kind of form the present and the future. So it's not just because, you know, you could quite easily have a brilliant museum focused on Springburn's past. I mean, you all know that, because it's such an important part of Glasgow, Scotland, the UK, the world. You know, it just goes, it ebbs and ebbs and ebbs. But on the flip side, Springburn now is quite a different place to what it was when the locomotive industry was still up and running. You've got a fantastic, diverse community, which you didn't have then. And that needs celebrated as well. And those stories need to be part of it too.
So there is a real need and want from working class communities to reclaim this power as to how we manage and use land and buildings differently. But that can only happen if we continue discussions and conversations on how we radically change that, and how we radically change policy within a local level and also on a national level.